So today, I'm just going to cover something that you've probably heard a lot about, but unfortunately you've probably heard wrong about most of it, and that's going to be one of the most interesting and, I think, consistent revealing political philosophies in the history of political philosophical thought, and that is anarchism. So this, as you can see by the title, is just an introduction to the history of the political philosophy. So I'll just kind of outline what I'm going to go over here. It's more of a history of the political philosophy. I'm going at the end to cover a brief there's a couple historical examples that'll play in, but it's more about the philosophy. And then I should have put this as a brief introduction, because to do an introduction to anarchism, you have to do probably a 1,000-page book. It's such a rich intellectual tradition that there's so much to it. So this is probably not going to do it justice. But I say all that to say, if I leave anything short and it doesn't seem like I fully fleshed it out, or you're just curious about something, a term, a person, a specific school of thought that I didn't cover entirely, or you're just curious about, let me know. I'll either remember it or know where to find it. If you're interested in researching at all any more anarchism in general, this is regarded by contemporary anarchists as one of the best books ever written on the subject by George Woodcock, Anarchism, History of Libertarian Ideas and Movements. I use a lot of reference from here. Colin Ward's a contemporary anarchist. He wrote an Oxford book on anarchism and used this kind of as a touchstone for that. Also, Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, Simon Blackburn, I use for some of the collectivist, individualist definitions. It's a great resource for everything in general. Jump right into it. So we kind of have to begin by saying, what is anarchism? And anarchy, anarchy generally has a kind of for at least until 1840 with Proudhon, we had it's a very negative term. What do you think of when you think of an anarchist or anarchy in general today? You think of college-age economic illiterates, Antifa, people throwing Molotovs around, and that's generally the picture that's been painted, the caricature, or more accurately, a straw man of anarchism. And it kind of really is a narrow and shallow view of what is really a deep intellectual tradition and has been populated by some of the most brilliant minds in all of history. Even some philosophers that are not well known for anarchism, but were anarchists, kind of come into play. The most prominent being I can think of be Albert Camus. I like saying Albert Camus, but that's just my Western bias coming in. Albert Camus, most known for his absurdism, but also, I have one of his quotes later, he's a pretty great figure in anarchist philosophy. So let's go right into the definition. Anarchy or anarchism, the word anarchy, the actual word, now it's kind of difficult because the actual linguistic analysis of the word and then the ideology that comes from it tend to be two separated things. So anarchy, you can see, just comes from the anarchia, which just means contrary to authority or without a ruler. Archy, oligarchy, monarchy, democracy, any of these things are rulers, ruled by the many, ruled by the few, ruled by one, mono, oligarch, any of that. So this just archy, and with the prefix of an, just without a ruler. But in the evolution of political ideas, you see, he says there, it can be seen as the ultimate projection of both liberalism and socialism, and differing strands of anarchist thought can be related to their emphasis on one or the other of these. That's the one I take from Colin Ward. I mentioned him a second ago in Anarchism, Very Short Introduction by Oxford University Press, so it's a good source, very reliable. So he uses the terms here, liberalism and socialism. I'll use socialism a bit. I'll probably more use collectivism. I'll probably use collectivism a little more than socialism, and I'll definitely use individualism more than liberalism, but they tend to be synonymous when it comes to anarchist philosophy. So I'll go through, I outline the basic definitions here. If you want more complete definitions, they're all in the Oxford, so I can outline those. It's a couple paragraphs for collectivism and individualism, but I shortened them down here. So collectivism, generally, and as I said, synonymous with the socialism and anarchism we see here. Socialism is also something that's kind of been misconstrued as a term. We think of it now in purely economic terms, but kind of in more 1800s, 19th century, and Enlightenment philosophy, socialism was less of an exact economic policy and more of an outlook on the individual's relation to society. That's why I tend to prefer the term collectivism, kind of bypass that misunderstanding of just the state owning means of production, and what we kind of think of socialism now is not really what the anarchist socialist would have meant by socialism. So just to dispel that really quickly. So in collectivism, it's just the political theory that regards the collective as the fundamental unit of social authority. So here's where we get the distinction, and then the individualists say, the view that the single person is the basic unit of political and economic analysis, and social wholes being merely logical constructions or ways of talking about numbers of such individuals and the relations among them. So you'll hear a lot, especially, well not especially, but in some contemporary circles you'll hear anarchism referred to as a exclusively leftist ideology, and that's just it's a misconstruction and a scholarly dishonesty about the actual history of this thought, because it originates kind of with a leftist economic vision, but then it evolves. Because you get really technical into those things, the leftists, libertarians say, well, libertarianism is initially leftist, so you can't use it. It's like, well, we're going to get really technical. Libertarian was initially a metaphysical term, so let's just all recognize that ideas evolve. It's much better. So the main split in anarchism comes between the collectivist and individualist, and that has ramifications for how their economic policy is going to evolve and how they're going to, but they do agree on some things, and it's really just this, that without a ruler, so without a formal state, without a authority, without a government, if you will, depending on how you define government. So let's go over here a little bit. There are a lot of thinkers that I would characterize almost as soft anarchists, because the term anarchist or anarchy was used non-negatively first in 1840 by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and we'll get into that later. So he's regarded as the father of anarchism, but we can trace back some of the logic used to formulate anarchist theory all the way back to, well, some say Zeno of Citium, and then Plato even. He says here, good people do not need laws, tell them to act responsibly, while bad people always find a way around the laws. That's kind of a driving tenet of anarchist philosophy, that law is a social construction and no measure of morality, which we've seen historically been demonstrably accurate. And then Robert Lefebvre here, might be pronouncing all his names wrong, let me know if I am. So if men are good, you don't need government. If men are evil or ambivalent, you don't dare have one. So basically, if men are good, they're not going to need this stomping authority that Hobbes envisioned in Leviathan, and if they're evil, you don't dare give them authority over the others, because then that just gives them a much easier way to tyrannize everybody else. And then Jefferson, you see a lot of the Enlightenment guys. I put this down here, I should put it up here, but kind of a lot of the anarchists were influenced by some of these Enlightenment classical liberals that came from the vein of John Locke, but then developed their own, like Denis Diderot and Voltaire, and then the founding fathers in general, primarily Patrick Henry, Paine, and Jefferson. So Jefferson, dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery comes from him, and that's kind of another driving principle of anarchism. Why have this safety while being tyrannized when you could have the dangerous, tempestuous sea of liberty, as Jefferson puts it. And so you can just read these quotes here. If you want me to go back to them, I can, but I won't read them all out. And then here's where Camus comes in. The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so very free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. It's an excerpt, I believe, from his book, The Rebel, section, Metaphysical Rebellion. And then Patrick Henry, everybody remembers his ever-famous quote, "Give me liberty or give me death," and he prefaces that by saying, is safety so great a good that it must be purchased at the price of chains and slavery, and so he kind of deals with that imagery there. I put Mencken here. He's a journalist. A lot of his thought is very synonymous with anarchist philosophy. While he's not really regarded as an anarchist in the strain of the philosophy, he really is one. He says here, I believe it's better to be free than to not be free, even when the former is dangerous and the latter safe, and so on and so forth. Then he has another quote where he talks about how people can never be governed and yet be free. That's a longer quote. I'll espouse that one a little more later. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of it a little bit, where the anarchists start to split, and that's going to be socialist anarchism. We'll start with that. So basic definition pulled it from a couple of books, both Ward and this one here, and then just the definitions you get is socialist anarchist favored a society in which all individuals advance together. It's very collective, very societally focused variant of anarchism. So the material differences kept to a minimum, contribution should be to society as a whole. So yeah, material differences kept to a minimum, and the ownership of property is really going to be a big part of where the anarchists verge and split with each other. Godwin, I believe, preceded Proudhon, but was kind of a pure intellectual, was not very as much read. Proudhon first coined the term anarchist as a non-negative thing in 1840. And then Mikhail Bakunin, who's kind of notorious for espousing a but a naturally violent form of anarchism. Most anarchists kind of go the peace angle. Bakunin, I shouldn't say most anarchists, but Bakunin was especially in favor of violent insurrection and overthrow. He's kind of known for that, characterized by that more than everything. Then Kropotkin, he wrote his most famous work was The Conquest of Bread. And then Tolstoy, who's a really interesting thinker. He kind of, whether or not you think it's him or Jesus that starts it, there's kind of a vein of anarchism called Christian anarchism, and Tolstoy is kind of the forefather of that. And then Emma Goldman, I felt morally obligated to point out that she started this thing called anarcho-feminism, but I don't feel morally obligated to talk much about anarcho-feminism because those things don't really need to go together. So the leftist socialist variants of anarchism include communism in the vein of Marx and Engels, syndicalism, mutualism, pacifism, feminism, primitivism, and then Christian anarchism. Tolstoy and a lot of people regard Jesus as actually one of the first anarchists. And so Proudhon was a very interesting thinker. He was actually not nearly as left-leaning as most of the socialist anarchists. He kind of, I think, started the economic policy called mutualism, which actually some individualists hold to. So it's kind of, but he was, I think I have some of his quotes here. Here we go, yeah. So he has, no, not that one. But basically property is theft is his most, oh, you can't see it there because Google cut it, great. He's actually quoted saying, this is popular, anarchy is order, government is civil war. So kind of before Proudhon, we have this view that without government, we have this total chaos, and with government, we have this order, and Proudhon flips that around and says, no, anarchy is order, government is chaos, and civil war. So he's an interesting thinker, and then mutualism is an interesting economic ideology. Basically, the core tenets of it are a free market like in a capitalist, but not capitalist, and if there's ownership of private property, you saw property theft is his most important, or not most important, but most popular thing he put out there. So he viewed property as theft and didn't believe in private property, but believed in free markets. So it's kind of an interesting blend of kind of this socialist ownership of property, but still free market systems. I'm not as well versed on the writings of Kropotkin as I am on some of the others. So, and Godwin. So if you have any more questions about that, I should go find them. Tolstoy is interesting. Here we have a couple of him. He says, even if the absence of government really did mean anarchy in a negative and disorderly sense, which is far from being the case, even then, no anarchical disorder would be worse than the position to which government has led humanity. That's a bold statement by Tolstoy there, and one that I think is, well, almost unanimously echoed by anarchists throughout, the tradition of the thought, even contemporary. It's kind of the basis of the ideology that, nothing could be worse. Even no government is better than where we're at now. So a lot of anarchists would hold to that, I think. But Tolstoy is the first to kind of put it in those terms and make it so shocking, but it's a very interesting way of looking at it. And then so the leftist socialist variants of anarchism include, I went over these, Marx. Whether or not you could call Marx an anarchist and Engels an anarchist is kind of a matter of dispute. Their society was viewed as stateless, but they also viewed the government as just the means through which the classes are kept intact. So their whole conception of what governments and markets and economies were was so radically different than most have thought. But we do have anarcho-communism as quite possibly, I think, the most popular or the largest branch of anarchism is this communist variant of it. But whether you can call Marx an anarchist is, I guess, a matter of debate. But I mean, from the definition we're going from this definition of stateless, the one I put up here, then he technically would be, because the society was stateless, but he didn't view the state as most anarchists do. So these thoughts on Marx aside, we'll move on. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. You'll hear leftist anarchists even today. I mean, they'll argue that anarchism is exclusively leftist. I kind of just say here that this assertion is a demonstration of significant ignorance and categorical error. So it's a complete misunderstanding and miscategorization of the theory, of the philosophy, and of the thinkers that kind of birthed it and allowed it to form and grow and evolve. Because this whole strand of individualist anarchism, you kind of have to throw it out if you hold to this only communists or only socialists can be anarchists thing. You throw out kind of what I think is actually the best school in the tradition, and that's where we move into the individualists. So they, in contrast to the socialists who view society with individuals advancing together, the individualists viewed society, or favored society, which will advance best when each individual is encouraged to accomplish what they can for themselves. Humanity is best served when people progress according to their individual abilities. This has kind of been categorized, not all the individuals would hold to what's called social Darwinism, and social Darwinism is not a very prominent view today. Not all individuals would hold to that, but that's kind of the core tenet of it, social Darwinism, that kind of this natural selection but applied to social classes should be implemented and individuals would flourish by themselves. So that's so the forerunner of individualist anarchism is a very interesting figure, Max Stirner, which is a pen name much like Mark Twain or even Voltaire. Stirner, his real name was Johann Caspar Schmidt. He was a school teacher at a girls' school, but did a lot of writing. Well, not a lot of writing. He wrote really one book that kind of inspired individualist tradition. He's the father of an ideology you'll probably hear a couple every once in a while, egoism, or specifically Stirnerite egoism. He founded it. And he wrote the book Ego in Its Own, or it's more accurately translated, The Unique in Its Property, in which he kind of takes a staunch individualist stance against the rising movement of, at the time it was Hegel and the young Hegelians, and so he kind of was arguing, kind of countering that, or at least trying to, and he kind of birthed the vein of, this staunch individualism that kind of gave rise to Nietzsche. Nietzsche's philosophy mirrors Stirner's in some ways, but they would vary a little bit, but they're surprisingly similar. Stirner's individualism is a strange brand. You'll see actually a lot of socialist anarchists in the contemporary world, or I don't know a lot I can say, but you will see contemporary anarchists or contemporary egoists who hold to communism or socialism, some form of it. So they kind of take Stirner's individualism and try to breed it with communist economic policy, which is just one of the biggest redundancies in the history of human thought. But it's something that people don't see contradiction with. And Stirner himself, some commentators on his writing said that his philosophy was, compatible with communism. So Stirner, calling him an individualist, is like he's kind of a bridge between the two, but his individualism was so staunch that it almost became socialistic, and that doesn't make sense, but a lot of Stirner doesn't make sense. But he inspired Nietzsche, who was Nietzsche's not really regarded much for his political philosophy because he doesn't emphasize it as much. A lot of his writing is more on, I don't even know exactly what you categorize it as, kind of along with Wittgenstein, disregarded most of metaphysics, so he focuses a lot more on criticizing other worldviews, and so his philosophy mostly epistemological, I think. But Nietzsche does say some things, and I'll go down here. If you ever want Nietzsche's thoughts on socialism or collectivism, this is an excerpt from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It says, "Thus from you the tyrant madness of impotence cries for equality, and so your most secret tyrant appetite disguises itself in words of virtue." So strong words from the mustachioed mentor there. And there's a section in Thus Spoke Zarathustra titled, the subtitle is Of the Tarantulas. If you want to look that up, he's arguing against socialism. Now, I think it's fair here also to make sure you understand that Nietzsche also very much hated capitalism. His writing on capitalism is rivaled only by his hatred of socialism, which Nietzsche pretty much hated everything. So he's, again, not a huge political figure, but his political philosophy and his philosophy in general was staunchly individualistic. And then what happened with anarchism is the good old Americans got a hold of it. And as Americans do, individualized it very much. The forerunner of this would be Josiah Warren. Benjamin Tucker, one of the most prominent individualist anarchists in American tradition, quoted and cited Warren a lot as his influence and his mentor, and the one who first showed him the light, actually. So Warren wrote a lot. He was the first, probably, of the American anarchists, and one of the most prominent. His writing is usually pretty brilliant if you read it. Tucker is also a great, here's one of his quotes. "Anarchists never claim that liberty will bring perfection. They simply say that its results are vastly preferable to those that follow authority." This is a little bit reminiscent of what we heard from Tolstoy earlier right here. These guys kind of, you see the socialist and the individualist kind of can agree on some things, and that is that even if we have disorder, it's better than government, generally. And then Thoreau actually could have, I actually have read Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. It's a great read. It's about 70 pages, shouldn't take long, and it's pretty amazing, his thoughts on, not only the individual's relation to government, but individuals' relation to each other under a government and how that works. So Thoreau is actually, I'll mention this a little bit later, autarchism. Thoreau's kind of thought of as kind of being a forerunner of autarchism, but also kind of a form of ecological anarchism, very much focused on nature. You get that from Walden. And then Lysander Spooner, this is one of my favorite thinkers ever. He's kind of in about the same time period of some of these guys. He's a staunch authoritarian, so this is a long quote by him. "A man's natural rights are his own against the whole world, and any infringement of them is equally a crime, whether committed by one man or by millions, whether committed by one man calling himself a robber, or by another name indicating his true character, or by millions calling themselves a government." So Spooner, this is a quote from his work, No Treason, A Constitution of No Authority, which is also a great read. He spends about, I don't know, a couple 150, 200 pages just ripping apart this classical conception of government as somehow benevolent, and shows that, as he does here, that really government is just a collective form of robbery, violence, and tyranny, but just made, legitimate by its own authority, which is redundant. So individualist schools, I mentioned the socialist ones earlier, so just individualist anarchism in general. Some people just take that label and don't get too technologically economical with it. Agorism, which is kind of a really interesting breed of it. It's usually within anarcho-capitalistic structures, but it's the view that basically black markets should run rampant and the government should be disposed of by means of letting the market choke it out rather than in kind of an insurrection. So agorism is more of a subset of anarcho-capitalism, but it is a really interesting take on economics in relation to government. Autarchism, as I said, is a really, I put it under here, but it's not in some conceptions thought of as actually a branch of anarchism. It just is from the autarkia, which is also Greek, meaning self-rule, and a lot of people quote or cite Thoreau as, initiating this. So it comes from him, it just means self-rule, and it's, but it generally that is with anarchism. And then anarcho-capitalism is really interesting we get into. That's founded by Murray Rothbard in the 1900s, I want to say. So Rothbard funds anarcho-capitalism, and you get also David Friedman builds on that. And then Ayn Rand is kind of one of the contemporary anarchist capitalists. Anarcho-capitalism is attacked by the left as not being anarchism, because anarchism historically is against all unjustified hierarchy, including economic, and so it's attacked by them, but then, the anarcho-capitalists, going by the definition of just a stateless society, would be, and then actually some of the historical examples of anarchism are anarcho-capitalistic, but just be aware that the leftists hold that it's not actually anarchism, it's just a form of autarchism or a form even of fascism, but leftist anarchists are not the ones you want to be getting your definitions from, just in general. Egoism, which is the ideology we see come from Stirner, which is just that the individual is basically the measure of all things, and any state authority is illegitimate, which is a common anarchist tenet, but egoism kind of takes it to a strangely, even very intense individualistic level that almost denies individualism. And then I put here in parentheses, in some cases, mutualism, because as I said, some individualist anarchists would hold to the mutualist economics of Proudhon and just deny private property, which is interesting. That's really the big distinction I'll outline a little bit here. The really big distinction between the leftists and right-wingers and anarchism is, which the left and right-wing thing is kind of a misleading categorization of political philosophy as we understand it now. It's more economic than anything, but it's kind of been dirtied by a lot of modern jargon. But anyways, so some individualists do hold a mutualist economic philosophy, but it's inherently more of a leftist thing. And then I did Nietzsche on socialism and collectivism. So I'll just outline a little bit here. Property, again, the left versus right distinction. The capitalists hold, of course, to private property, as all capitalists do, the anarcho-capitalists. And then the leftists would deny any kind of, private ownership of property. The syndicalists would believe that the means of production should be owned by the workers. Communists will say everyone is. There's variance even within the socialist strands and individualists. But so that's a big distinction you get between the anarchists is their views on property. So you have Proudhon, who says property is theft, and then you have guys like Rothbard, who in the later the 20th century says that capitalism is the fullest expression of anarchism. So you have very much of a variance there on their thoughts on property. Historical examples, again, as I said, I'm going over the philosophy more than anything, so I won't go too much into this or worry about it, because people will say it's never tried or never worked. It's only partially true. The American Wild West. There's an article, if you want to read a good resource on historical examples of anarchism, the Mises Institute or Mises Institute online has a whole study article on historical applications of anarchism. The American Wild West being one of the best, because I didn't mean to rhyme there, but it did. So the anarchists will say that the American Wild West is kind of like that because, before the government really got out and populated the Western America, it was pretty much all the private property transactions were done by individuals, between individuals. There wasn't a state intervention in their interaction. There wasn't a state-mandated law. There was just an elected sheriff. So all their private property was done without a government. All their law was done without a government. All their building. So the American Wild West is an example of a very individualistic variant of anarchism. And then one of the most prominent, but also most interesting, is medieval Ireland, Celtic Ireland, from 650 to 1650. For about 1,000 years, they didn't have a formal state. They had tuaths, which were kind of tribes, and all their police, their military, their courts were all kind of handled privately. So that's an anarcho-capitalistic example, kind of an ancient variant of anarcho-capitalism. But there's also discrepancy on whether or not they were actually anarchists, but Mises does a good article on that as well. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit. I mean, obviously we'll get into this a little bit more when we get into Q&A or just our open discussion. But there are basic criticisms of anarchism that have been held to throughout the history of it. Most often it's attacked as being not pragmatic. It's not so much attacks on the ideology. I mean, you get to that because the moral implications of it are very consistent. You know, the lack of tyranny, the individual autonomy, the free and voluntary relations between individuals. Most people don't disagree with a lot of the tenets of anarchism. They disagree with whether or not it would actually work in practicality. So most of the basic criticisms you'll get of anarchism are on a pragmatic level, not at an ideological level. But you do get some at an ideological level, primarily from authoritarians. Within the libertarian community, they'll agree with the tenets of anarchism, just believe they should be implemented better. And then I put this here, anarchist logic versus political relativism, and I alluded to this earlier. What I mean by that is the anarchists versus a political relativist structure of morality. And, the view that law is somehow a measure of morality is obviously torn apart by anarchist logic very easily when you look at and realize throughout its history that the Holocaust was legal for the German citizens. And so that's just one example. There are many. I mean, even in America, the drug war we have now, the prohibition, FDR imprisoning Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II. I mean, there have been near infinite number of things that have been mandated and legal by the government, but what most of us would regard as morally wicked. So the anarchist logic kind of, I think, is consistent in its criticism of political relativism, which is kind of a take on cultural relativism, but more political in its structure, that governments somehow can mandate morality by law, and that's obviously a ridiculous notion. And then the incoherency of authoritarian structures is one thing that's important to I think, touch on here, and that's just that another basic criticism of anarchism is that, people can't be trusted with freedom. So in order to prevent people from being trusted with freedom, we trust some with power and let them decide for the others. So there's this inconsistency and incoherency in that structure that is pretty obvious very, very initially, that if you don't trust people with freedom, how are you going to trust them with power? And that goes all the way back to Leif Rivera's quote here. Where does he say it here? Yeah. So if men are good, you don't need government. If men are evil or ambivalent, you don't dare have one. So if people are good enough, they're not gonna need laws to act morally. But if they do need laws to act morally and they're that evil, then you should definitely not want to give them power over other individuals, or they're going to use that to instantiate the greatest evil we've ever seen in the world. And so that's kind of the anarchist take or viewpoint on the incoherency of authoritarianism. So I think to summarize, again, it's very general. I went over, it's a very, very general outline of political philosophy. It's an extremely rich and complicated tradition. You get about at least a dozen different schools within anarchism, individualism, socialism, and then each school has about 40 thinkers of it that all vary, and so it's extremely, there's a lot of research that goes into understanding even the basics of it. So this is just a very simple outline of the basics of the political philosophy and how it developed, and there's a lot more to how it developed too, but I hope this is at least an introduction. And so I think anarchist philosophy in general, so kind of unanimously between the socialists and the individualists, is best characterized by the following quote by George Woodcock in this book. He says, "To die placing liberty above law is the death of an anarchist." So that's really what we see that characterizes anarchism and sets it apart. It has one very consistent principle that it holds to, whether any variant of it holds to, and in whatever society it holds to, a very consistent principle, and that is that of freedom and liberty being valued above all else, including safety and basically anything that the government says they provide. And so yeah, that's about it. That's the general outline of the political philosophy. Again, as I said, you could stand up here and talk for 10 hours and you'd still not really not know everything or even dip your toes into it. But yeah, so I outlined some basic questions. I think, what did I do, 6 here? Just that I thought might be common questions you'd have. But if there's something I didn't fully cover, something you just want more information on, something you want an opinion on, or more resources, if I don't know the answer to it, I'll know certainly where to find it. So yeah, I have a couple of these if we need questions, but if everybody's open to just going right into discussion, that's fine too. But any questions, comments, concerns, gripes, complaints, general thoughts, anything you want more fleshed out, anything I didn't cover fully, any particular thinker or thought strand I left out or didn't fully develop, questions on that. Anything, or we can just open it to discussion? Good? All right.
Discussion would be good.
All right, good? Okay, so